I want you to take a close look at these two maps, the ones that Nami puzzles together to realize that Sky Island and Jaya once used to be one big skull-shaped island. But if you really look carefully, you might notice that something's off here. Way off, because the compass roses are actually oriented differently. The answer: in the last 400 years, when the original map was drawn, the poles of the One Piece world have flipped by 90 degrees, causing global flooding, magnetic anomalies, and Laugh Tale itself to be shifted all the way to the North Pole. And somehow, Blackbeard and Shanks are at the center of it all. That's the theory I want to explore with you today. Now, as I've mentioned before on the channel, I think I've been rereading the entire series in Japanese recently, and this time, something really caught my eye that I never really questioned before. In the very first chapter of the story, Shanks says that his crew has spent enough time on Dawn Island now, and that it's time to head north after giving Luffy his Devil Fruit and the Straw Hat. But why north? What's up north of the East Blue of Fuchsia Village? Well, I've been starting to wonder that a lot. And then, just a couple of chapters later, Shanks and Buggy have a very heated argument about which was colder, the North Pole or the South Pole. Well, according to Oda, the correct answer, by the way, is the South Pole. That's not the point, though. Why have this debate at all about a place that we've never been to in the story, but that's been popping up suspiciously often? And once me and the team really started digging into the idea that the poles were really important, I found that some other creators have actually dug into this topic before. For example, there's a video by the very big Japanese YouTuber Dodo Pizza or Redditor Zagrush Uchiha here, who both dropped their theories around 3 years ago about pole shifts because they both had some great ideas about why the North and South poles shifting might be the huge secret of the story. But now, and especially with the Shanks part, we have a lot more story to work with and a lot more evidence for it. So I really want to add on to this concept with some new ideas, and then obviously, feed my own stuff into this as well, especially with the Shanks stuff. So, to start with, where are the poles in One Piece in the first place? Well, the answer is not so easy. Both the planetary model in the library of Ohara and some of Oda's notes do show where the blue planet's north and south poles are. They're not in the middle of the north and south blue like you might expect. They're actually along different points along the red line. Specifically, they do seem to be offset exactly 90 degrees from both Marijoa and Reverse Mountain, respectively. And much more importantly, of course, we want to answer in this video, what could be hiding beneath all that ice? Could it be something like Laugh Tale or the One Piece itself? However, I'm not so sure that the One Piece would be located on the current North Pole. It might be, but it also might be where the North Pole used to be. Because again, based on those Skypiea maps that Oda drew that we talked about at the beginning, the poles of the One Piece world might have shifted. Also, a pole shift, just for context by the way, is actually a real world phenomenon in which the magnetic poles slowly drift. In fact, magnetic north right now isn't actually in what we consider Earth's physical North Pole. It's been drifting closer to Siberia every single year recently. And throughout Earth's history, the North and South poles have slowly been flipping places hundreds of times, as indicated by a lot of geological records. Now, in the real world, these pole shifts take quite a long time and are considered fairly harmless. However, there are of course also some really fun conspiracy theories that Oda also loves, that a sudden pole shift of the Earth could actually cause apocalyptic weather patterns and mass extinction events and flooding, often tied to Atlantis and stuff like that. And personally, based on a lot of things in the story like aliens and cities in the moon and ancient lost civilizations, I do think that Oda loves himself a good conspiracy theory. But not only that, he also loves himself some Miyazaki as well. And when Oda was just 3 years old, a very impressionable little guy, Miyazaki, the founder of Studio Ghibli, early in his career directed the anime series called Future Boy Conan, in which super magnetic weapons twisted the world's axis and caused an apocalyptic flood that fully submerged many continents. And obviously, since we now actually know that Oda's story also features a flooded post-apocalyptic world that has lost all of its technology, and combining that with the fact that we know the magnetic poles shifted 90 degrees, I think we can take things a lot further here. I think that at some point, the One Piece planet itself might have been shifted 90 degrees. fully changing its axis of rotation and resulting in huge sea level changes and the insane weather throughout the world that makes navigation completely impossible in the Grand Line with regular means. What used to be the frigid North and South Pole would then suddenly become tropical islands right now, and basically vice versa. The ice that was there may have then melted, and the direction of tides may have changed, leading to some terrible flooding, especially across the Grand Line, where we know a massive continent now lies completely submerged. In other words, the One Piece planet itself might have been broken, and it's now up to Monkey D. Luffy / protagonist of the story to fix everything. Did you ever notice how when Roger asks Rayleigh to join his crew, he actually says literally, "Let's turn the world upside down"? How about when Whitebeard says that when the One Piece is found, the world will be turned upside down? Well, what if they actually mean it literally? Like, what if the One Piece turns the world, the planet, upside down? If you'll indulge me for a moment and just assume for a moment that it's true. If the world is currently out of balance, off axis because of that massive pole shift, then maybe there's a way to fix it and bring the world back into its correct natural state, north pointing up, south pointing down, right? Because the One Piece world we know is absolutely broken in some fundamental way. Navigation by regular means is basically impossible in the Grand Line. Each individual island has its own magnetic polarity, and the island whales keep ramming themselves against the red line, and in real life, whales do use the magnetism of the world to actually help them navigate in the ocean, as do many other animals, including the Southbirds, who have this weird panel where some of them are facing in the other direction. Now, the island whales themselves are trying to reach a certain destination according to the magnetic fields, but there's a massive object in the way because the magnetic fields aren't now where they're actually supposed to be. At one point, the pole shifts may have been on some kind of regular natural cycle that didn't really interfere with things, kind of like in the real world, but at some point, some advanced device or power or ability may have thrown the entire planet into complete disarray, because if the entire planet shifted its rotational axis, it would have just meant intense changes to the climate and, all the crazy stuff that we talked about earlier, like massive flood waves. Just as an example, due to centrifugal force that Oda, by the way, absolutely thinks about, oceans are actually higher along the equator, right? It kind of squeezes the Earth out a little bit. So while at one point I actually thought that the sea level rise might just all be due to Emu spamming some ancient weapon, it could also be that the continent that once existed in the Grand Line is actually submerged because it suddenly became the equator. And if these changes were once on a gradual cycle instead of a huge all or nothing shift in an instant, it could also explain why so many places in the Grand Line like Alabasta, Wano, or Dressrosa are built on higher ground, their capitals occupying elevated plateaus. I hope you agree that these places just look like they've all been built with the possibility of massive flooding in mind, even though some of them were built long before the Void Century when Emu first flooded the world. And could this just actually be part of the reason why Emu decided to erase so much history, right? So that people wouldn't just be prepared for the floods that they used to be able to routinely prepare for? Now, of course, the possibility of how exactly this all might have gone down are practically endless without Oda giving us more information. At the same time, though, it also means that returning the world to its natural state would bring an entirely new meaning to a central theme of the story, because we know that Luffy is destined to bring a new dawn to the world. And changing the planet's axes changes where east is, which would then literally bring a new dawn at a different direction of the sky. It's not just a metaphor about a better, more hopeful era. The sun would just actually physically rise in a different cardinal direction. Characters like Toki and Pedro and so many others in the story have talked, of course, about the new dawn being on its way, and this would just make it happen in the truest sense of the word. And for even more evidence of the pole shift, Toki, by the way, since we speak of her, who came from the Void Century 800 years ago, wasn't able to navigate and locate Wano after arriving in the future, proof that the world itself has changed since the Void Century, because it's not like she went to the current Wano and was like, oh, this looks different. No, she couldn't find its location. And I personally just really love this idea because it actually solves part of a theory that really had me scratching my head for a long time, because a while back I made a massive long theory about a concept called the Bagua. It's a term used in Feng Shui, and it's also of course where the name for Kaido's Thunder Bagua attack comes from as well. And it's connected to the story of One Piece in every way imaginable. I'm not going to go into all the other detail that's irrelevant, but I'm pretty sure that the Bagua is the key behind Joy Boy's symbol, and it's all about bringing the world back into balance. Now, back in the day, I didn't really know what that meant exactly. However, if the world as a planet was actually tilted 90 degrees out of balance, then bringing it back into the correct alignment actually suddenly retroactively makes the theory work absolutely beautifully. And the idea of Luffy's ultimate goal being to bring the world back into its balance especially makes perfect sense if you consider how connected he is to the moon. We've talked about that idea before as well. Nika is called the sun god, but isn't it weird how much he seems to be much more related to the moon and the moon imagery, right? Like when Luffy first goes Gear 5, there was this iconic panel of him silhouetted against the moon. Then there's the Ming Sulong transformation under full moon, where they also gain the same white hair and red eyes, just like Gear 5. So there is something weird going on here, especially when you think about the people of the half moon and the people of the full moon from the Harley text. We also know that the Ohara planetary model, which by the way, I kind of really want like a model like that for my studio. But anyways, like this model shows several moons surrounding the planet, but we really only ever get to see one in the night sky. So did these moons just disappear somehow? As you might know, in the real world, our actual moon acts as a massive gravitational stabilizer for the Earth itself, keeping the planet's axial tilt locked in a narrow range of like 22.1 to 24.5 degrees. And this angle creates Earth's stable, predictable seasons, preventing extreme climate swings. So could the reason that the One Piece world's weather is like so incredibly unstable be because somehow these other moons that have stabilized the planet have now gone missing? And if so, Luffy restoring balance to the planet could have something to do with either replacing those moons or somehow providing a new stability or some anchor between the planet and its existing moon. Whatever the case may be, the One Piece itself might actually be some kind of device that actually brings the world back to its correct alignment and prevents these drastic pole shifts, bringing the world back into balance, creating a new dawn, and, you know, having old continents and countries re-emerge from the ocean. But to use the One Piece, Luffy of course has to first find it, and I do think that this theory actually also, funnily enough, narrows down where Laugh Tale and the One Piece itself could actually be hidden. As I teased earlier, it could either be the current North Pole, hence why Shanks might have gone there, or the former North Pole. Honestly, both of them have their fair share of evidence pointing towards it, so I'm not quite sure which one to believe just yet, but let's just talk about both of them. First up is the actual current North Pole, the Arctic of the One Piece planets. During Thriller Bark, Chopper actually speculated that the ancient giant Oars died in the Land of Ice because he was just completely unprepared for the elements with his big loincloth. Now, previously I've believed that maybe this Land of Ice might have just been the Ringo region in Wano, since that's also tied to Moria, but this has not been confirmed, so maybe I was actually wrong about this and he was actually in the Arctic on the North Pole. And a very interesting possibility for why he was so unprepared? Well, what if he was actually up there and that's when the sudden pole shift actually happened, causing that region of the world to just freeze quickly right along with Oars himself. Also, Oars of course isn't the only ancient giant preserved in ice. There's also the very mysteriously frozen Galela, the legendary shipwrights who constructed Pluton. And I've actually speculated before that Oars was also potentially involved with the Galela, so did they all just get frozen by a sudden pole shift? And did it also freeze Laugh Tale or wherever they were alongside with them? Think about it. If the poles are shifting naturally every 400 years by 90 degrees, that might mean that the One Piece is only accessible every 800 years when that part of the world is currently unfrozen. This could actually even explain why the road poneglyphs are necessary to pinpoint the location of Laugh Tale, because for all we know, the location of Laugh Tale itself is also shifting along with the poles every 400 years. Which then would also explain a bunch of other things, like if the One Piece is where the North Pole is right now, then it would be buried in the middle of the red line, and maybe it's only reachable when it's in certain spots, and it's warm enough. And maybe that's why Roger was too early, but Joy Boy wasn't. Like, Laugh Tale was reachable, but the One Piece itself was still frozen and inaccessible. Or whatever he found on Laugh Tale might not be able to be used until the next pole flip happens, because he would just pass away from his incurable disease before he could ever live through that. Again, assuming that these poles might be rotating or shifting on a regular schedule, it could mean that North would be up and in the right location again after 1,600 years, which is coincidentally and weirdly enough when the Sea Circle calendar began as well, which would then line up with the poles literally rotating in a circle. The sea actually circling and changing 90 degrees every 400 years, and maybe that's started 1,600 years ago roughly. That would then explain why Joy Boy was able to hide the One Piece 800 years ago when that area wasn't frozen, and it would be locked away for precisely 800 years when the Arctic thawed again. Also, speaking of that Arctic and snowy region, I kind of have to ask the question, is the Davy clan that we've been speaking so much about from there originally too? That would give a lot more evidence for the idea that Laugh Tale was part of the Great Kingdom and that Davy D. Jones might have been its ruler. And the reason I believe that this might be the case all comes back to one man, Blackbeard. Promised he'd come in here. Remember when Shanks and Buggy met Teach as kids? They actually learned that Blackbeard never sleeps, and this then led to the idea that people from snowy countries don't sleep in general. Actually, on Drum Island, where Blackbeard was actually first introduced and mentioned, Luffy tells Sanji that somebody in a bar once told him that very rumor, which of course means that it was probably Shanks telling him that when he was a kid. And technically, we don't know where Blackbeard's birthplace actually is, or if it's actually Port, only that it's somewhere on the Grand Line, and it could be a winter island. Now, it's actually confirmed that Teach's birthplace is different from God Valley, and that he was only ever moved there with iddies for their own safety, which, in retrospect, did not work out exactly super great. And by now, Shanks has probably figured out that Blackbeard has a connection to God Valley and his membership in the Davy clan. So, could it be that Blackbeard and the Davy family are originally from one of the coldest places of all, the North Pole? Could the North Pole have a connection to the Great Kingdom, Davy Jones, and more importantly, the One Piece itself? This would also actually lend some fun credibility to one of the wildest Blackbeard theories out there, the Kraken theory. Obviously, ideas that Blackbeard would have a third zone devil fruit, because he has a Paramecia and a Logia. That idea has been floating around for many years, and one of the most popular ones is that he has or will obtain a Kraken fruit. And do you know where Krakens are from in One Piece? Yep, the North Pole. We know this because in the Fishman Island arc, Vanderdecken called Tsurume here a monster of the Arctic, so at some point, Hody Jones actually captured this creature from the North Pole. And if that's the case, then maybe to correctly unlock Laugh Tale or to properly use whatever the One Piece actually is, someone with Davy lineage like Teach or very possibly Shanks might actually be a necessary part of the puzzle. I've already thought that it's pretty likely that Luffy will have to work together with Blackbeard in order to defeat Emu, but it might even be the case that it'll take a Davy along with Luffy's Sun God powers to claim the One Piece and finally restore balance to the planet. However, I could then also see Laugh Tale being at the former North Pole, which might then just be Reverse Mountain. Like, if the poles are actually flipping 90 degrees every 400 years along the red line, that would mean that Reverse Mountain and Marijua become the North and South Pole along the same time frame. And if Laugh Tale itself is shifting along with the poles, then after the next pole shift, it might end up at Reverse Mountain. And since Reverse Mountain is the only way into the Grand Line, it might also somehow be the only way to access the One Piece as well through some kind of secret entrance. Because if there's one thing that I know about treasure, especially in One Piece, it's that X marks the spot. And what does Reverse Mountain just literally look like? A big freaking X on the entire global map of One Piece. You can even see it on the very map where Oda also has scribbled these two sketches of the One Piece axis on it as well. So just saying. Now, why do I think that this would be the North Pole and not the South Pole? Well, there are two islands that we know about that are in fairly close proximity to Reverse Mountain. One is Lodestar, the final island of the Grand Line, where pirates are supposed to first learn about the poneglyphs and the existence of the true final island, Laugh Tale. By the way, that name is also funny because Lodestar is actually a very old term for a pole star, a star used in navigation due to its alignment with a directional pole, most often, of course, the North Star. And if that term pole star also rings a bell in the One Piece context, it's because Loketown is located in a group of islands called the Pole Star Islands. Yes, you can see it right here on our beautiful pixel map, which, by the way, you can get on the Patreon. Little Patreon plug. Shout out to everyone who supports it. Anyways, this could mean that both Loketown and Lodestar are associated with the north direction, despite being nowhere near what appears to be the North Pole, and they're both on different sides of a giant X in the middle of the ocean. If the sea levels have actually risen dramatically and submerged once existing continents here, these islands, along with Reverse Mountain, may have once been part of one larger landmass, explaining their interconnected names. And once again, it was Shanks who, funnily enough, could have hinted at this a long time ago. I already mentioned how in Chapter 1, his crew was heading north when they left Dawn Island and left Luffy. This could have been part, of course, of the secret mission, I believe, that was given to him by Roger, or something he learned about during his time as an undercover Holy Knight, but he'd already completed maybe the most important step of the grand plan, which was finding the Nika fruit and finding a great candidate, Luffy, having him eat it. So maybe to prepare the path for the next Sun God Nika, he then had to prepare something up north. Was this the North Blue, or the North Pole, or where the former North Pole was? Did he actually set sail towards Reverse Mountain and the Grand Line? In particular, did he sail towards Loketown? Quick reminder, the Loke in Loketown comes from the two words prologue and epilogue. It's called the town of the beginning and the town of the end, partly because it's where Roger's adventure first began and then ended with his execution, but that beginning and ending might also just apply to Luffy's journey through the Grand Line and the series itself, because the very first panel of One Piece was, of course, set right there, and the One Piece itself might be found right there or near here as well. Little fun fact, during Roger's speech in the first chapter, when he says that he left the treasure right there for everyone to find, he actually says in Japanese, "Soko ni oitekita." Now, it's usually translated to there or in that place, but as someone who speaks Japanese and looking a little bit at the nuance here, soko is usually used to indicate when something is close to the person you're speaking to than to yourself, right? Like, I'm here, it's koko, and then you're standing there, soko, and then, you know, if it's somewhere else where none of us is, then it's asoko, which would mean over there, as in far away. In other words, Roger might have been telling the crowd at Loketown that the One Piece was right there, beneath them, closer than they ever could have imagined, beneath them in the submerged continent that once housed the Great Kingdom. Hiding the treasure in plain sight all along would have just also been the most Oda move of all time, and Luffy literally passing by it like after setting sail. But it might not be accessible, of course, until that next pole shift, and if one happens every 400 years, then one is now due to happen any moment, truly launching the story into its endgame. And if Luffy finds Laugh Tale with all the pieces in place, he could finally activate the One Piece, which might then shift the world's poles back into their proper place, bringing the new dawn to the world and putting an end to Imu's plans once and for all. However, it probably won't be that easy because Imu's the kind of guy who's always one step ahead, right? We've kind of learned that. After all, he's been kind of putting his plan into motion for now almost a millennium, and I explain exactly what that plan might be in this mega theory right here. Go check it out if you have some time to kill or something to clean. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. Let me know what you think. I actually really like this idea, but let me know your thoughts in the comments. And thanks so much to our Patreons, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a wonderful rest of your day.